Imagine watching your neighbor being sewn alive into the rotting carcass of a horse, left to die in the most horrific way imaginable. This wasn't fiction. This wasn't madness. This was justice in medieval Europe. Tonight, we're diving deep into the twisted traditions that defined the darkest era of human civilization. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were celebrated customs, religious rituals, and social practices that entire communities participated in with enthusiasm. From the blood-soaked wedding nights that ended in death, to the religious festivals where torture was entertainment, to the bizarre judicial practices that defied all human logic, we're about to uncover the most disturbing traditions that medieval Europe embraced as normal. But here's what will truly shock you. These weren't the practices of a few deranged individuals. These were the cherished traditions of entire societies, passed down through generations, blessed by the church, and celebrated by kings and peasants alike. Welcome to Medieval Sins, where history drops the fairy tales and gets disturbingly real. The tradition of judicial combat. When God decided justice through blood. In the medieval mind, there was no higher authority than God himself. And when human courts couldn't determine guilt or innocence, they turned to the divine through one of the most barbaric judicial practices in history: trial by combat. This wasn't just about settling disputes between knights in shining armor. This was a legal system that forced everyone, from accused murderers to disputed property owners, to literally fight for their lives in front of cheering crowds. The process was as twisted as it was formal. When someone was accused of a crime, they could demand trial by combat, believing that God would grant victory to the innocent. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. If you were too old, too young, or too weak to fight, you had to find a champion. And if your champion lost, you died. Women accused of adultery were forced to watch as their chosen champions battled their accusers to the death. Children accused of theft had to rely on hired fighters who often cared more about payment than justice. The elderly faced the choice between certain death in combat or confession under torture. The combat itself was a spectacle of brutality. Fighters used maces, swords, and even their bare hands. The battle continued until one combatant was dead, disabled, or surrendered. And surrender often meant execution anyway. The crowds gathered like it was entertainment, cheering as blood soaked the ground, believing they were witnessing divine judgment. But the most twisted aspect wasn't the violence itself. It was the unwavering faith that this brutality revealed God's will. When an innocent person died in combat, the community didn't question the system. They assumed the victim must have been guilty after all, because God had spoken through violence. This practice continued for centuries, with the church's full blessing, until even medieval society began to recognize its fundamental madness. The Catholic Church, the supposed beacon of mercy and compassion, developed one of the most psychologically twisted traditions in medieval history: the ordeal of the consecrated host. When someone was accused of lying, stealing, or committing adultery, they were forced to receive communion, but with a terrifying twist. The accused had to swallow the consecrated host while the entire congregation watched, believing that if they were guilty, God would punish them immediately. The psychological torture was immense. The accused person had to stand before their community, take the holy bread, and pray that they wouldn't choke, fall ill, or show any sign of divine displeasure. The congregation watched every facial expression, every swallow, every breath, looking for signs that God was rejecting the guilty party. But here's the most disturbing part. The placebo effect worked in reverse. People who knew they were innocent sometimes still choked or felt ill from pure anxiety, leading to their conviction. Meanwhile, skilled liars and psychopaths often showed no reaction at all, walking away vindicated. The church encouraged this practice because it gave them enormous power over the population. Anyone could be accused, anyone could be forced to undergo this ordeal, and the church officials were the ones who interpreted God's response. Communities became paranoid surveillance states where neighbors watched each other for signs of guilt that would require the ordeal. Children were taught to fear receiving communion if they had any sin on their conscience, creating a generation of people terrified of their own religion. This tradition persisted for over 3 centuries, with thousands of people condemned based on their body's natural stress response to being publicly accused and spiritually threatened. Medieval communities had a twisted way of dealing with behavior they disapproved of, the charivari. This was a tradition where entire towns would organize elaborate public humiliation campaigns that often ended in death. The charivari targeted people whose personal lives offended community sensibilities. A widow who remarried too quickly, a couple with a significant age gap, a man who was considered too submissive to his wife, or anyone whose relationship didn't fit rigid social norms became fair game for this collective psychological torture. The process was as organized as it was cruel. The community would gather at night, armed with pots, pans, and other noise-making instruments. They would surround the target's home, creating a deafening cacophony while chanting humiliating songs and verses specifically composed to mock the victims. But this wasn't just noise. The crowd would throw rotten food, animal waste, and sometimes stones. They would demand that the offending parties come outside and endure public humiliation, forcing them to listen to detailed descriptions of their supposed sins and moral failings. The charivari could last for days or even weeks. Every night, the community would return, making sleep impossible, destroying property, and psychologically breaking down their targets. Children were encouraged to participate, learning that community-sanctioned cruelty was not only acceptable, but virtuous. The most twisted aspect was that victims had no legal recourse. Since the entire community participated, including local officials, there was no authority to appeal to. People literally had to endure torture by democracy. Many victims fled their homes, abandoned their livelihoods, and disappeared into the wilderness rather than face continued communal persecution. Others broke down completely, some taking their own lives to escape the relentless humiliation. The church not only tolerated but often encouraged charivari, seeing it as a way to enforce moral standards without official involvement. This tradition spread across Europe, with each region developing its own variations of community-sanctioned psychological warfare. Blood libel and ritual murder accusations. When anti-Semitism became a death festival. Perhaps no medieval tradition was more systematically twisted than the blood libel accusations against Jewish communities. These weren't isolated incidents of prejudice. They were organized, community-wide festivals of violence that entire societies participated in with religious fervor. The blood libel claimed that Jewish people kidnapped Christian children, murdered them in ritualistic ways, and used their blood for religious purposes. This was complete fabrication, but medieval Christian communities embraced these accusations as absolute truth, using them to justify some of the most horrific mass violence in history. The process followed a predictable pattern that reveals the systematic nature of this tradition. Someone would claim that a Christian child had disappeared. Without any investigation, the community would immediately blame the local Jewish population. Rumors would spread like wildfire, each retelling adding more horrific details about supposed ritual murders. The accusations themselves were deliberately designed to be as disturbing as possible. Jews were accused of crucifying children, draining their blood, mixing it with unleavened bread, and consuming it during Passover. These stories were told in churches, spread in popular songs, and depicted in artwork, embedding them deep in the community's collective imagination. What followed was organized genocide disguised as religious justice. Entire Jewish communities, men, women, children, and elderly, would be rounded up and subjected to torture designed to extract confessions. The torture was so severe that many victims would confess to anything to make it stop, providing the evidence the Christian community needed to justify mass murder. The killings themselves were public spectacles. Jewish families were burned alive in their homes while crowds cheered. Children were thrown into fires as their parents watched. The violence was so extreme that even some medieval chroniclers, writing in an era known for its brutality, described it as excessive. But here's the most twisted element. These massacres were often timed to coincide with Christian holidays, particularly Easter. Communities would celebrate the resurrection of Christ by murdering their Jewish neighbors, seeing no contradiction between their faith's message of love and their actions of hatred. This tradition spread across Europe, with each region developing its own variations. Some communities created elaborate plays reenacting the supposed murders. Others built monuments commemorating the martyred Christian children. The blood libel became so ingrained in medieval culture that it survived in various forms for centuries. Medieval justice took a particularly macabre turn with the ordeal of the bier, a tradition that forced dead bodies to participate in their own murder investigations. This practice reveals how deeply supernatural thinking had penetrated the medieval legal system. When someone died under suspicious circumstances, their corpse was placed on a bier, a platform used for displaying the dead. Then, anyone suspected of murder was forced to approach the body and touch it, while the entire community watched for signs of guilt. The belief was that the dead person's body would react to the presence of their killer. The corpse might bleed, change color, or show other signs of recognition. But the psychological pressure on the living was enormous. Suspects had to approach a decaying body, often someone they knew in life, and touch it, while an entire community watched for any sign of nervousness or guilt. The process was deliberately designed to be as terrifying as possible. The body was often displayed for days, allowing decomposition to set in. The suspect had to touch the corpse's face, hands, and sometimes the wounds themselves, all while maintaining composure that would prove their innocence. But here's where it gets truly twisted. The community members watching the ordeal were actively looking for any excuse to declare the suspect guilty. A slight tremor, a change in breathing, even reluctance to touch the body could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. The accused was essentially guaranteed to show some sign of stress, given the horrific nature of what they were being forced to do. The ordeal of the bier created a feedback loop of community paranoia. Since someone had to be guilty and the corpse would supposedly identify the killer, the community would continue forcing suspects to undergo the ordeal until they found someone whose natural stress response could be interpreted as guilt. This tradition was particularly cruel to family members of the deceased, who were often the primary suspects. Widows were forced to touch their dead husbands' bodies to prove they hadn't poisoned them. Children had to touch their parents' corpses to demonstrate they hadn't committed patricide. The grief of loss was compounded by the horror of being suspected and the trauma of the ordeal itself. Every January, medieval Europe celebrated one of its most twisted traditions, the Feast of Fools. This wasn't just a carnival or festival. It was a sanctioned period when the entire social order was inverted. Sacred institutions were mocked, and behavior that would normally result in death was not only permitted but encouraged. The Feast of Fools took place in churches, the very heart of medieval society. Lower-ranking clergy would elect a Bishop of Fools, who would parody religious services, deliver blasphemous sermons, and lead the congregation in activities that bordered on sacrilege. The regular clergy participated willingly, abandoning their dignity and religious duties for days of sanctioned chaos. But the celebration extended far beyond the church. The entire community participated in a complete reversal of social norms. Servants mocked their masters, children ridiculed their parents, and the poor openly insulted the wealthy. Cross-dressing was not only permitted but encouraged, with men and women switching roles in elaborate displays of gender confusion. The festival included ritualized violence and humiliation. Community members would be selected for public mockery, forced to endure elaborate practical jokes that often resulted in serious injury. People were tarred and feathered, dunked in freezing water, or subjected to other forms of entertainment that blurred the line between fun and torture. The most disturbing aspect was how this tradition revealed the deep tensions and resentments within medieval society. The Feast of Fools provided a safety valve for social pressure, allowing people to express their hatred for authority, their frustration with social inequality, and their resentment of religious control, but only for a few days, after which they had to return to their oppressed lives. The church initially encouraged this tradition, believing it would make people more compliant the rest of the year. But the celebrations often got out of control, with participants taking the opportunity to settle real grudges, destroy property, and engage in behavior that crossed every line of medieval morality. The medieval church developed numerous methods for determining guilt through divine intervention, but few were as psychologically twisted as the ordeal of the cross. This tradition forced accused parties to stand with their arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, maintaining this position for hours while the community watched for signs of divine judgment. The process seems deceptively simple, but it was designed to be excruciatingly painful. The accused person had to maintain the crucifixion position, arms extended horizontally, feet together, while prayers were recited, hymns were sung, and the community watched for any sign of weakness or collapse. The ordeal could last for hours. As muscles began to cramp, arms started to shake, and the body began to fail, the community interpreted these natural physical responses as signs of guilt. If the accused person maintained the position longer than their accuser, they were declared innocent. If they collapsed first, they were guilty. But the psychological cruelty was even worse than the physical torture. The accused person was forced to imitate the crucifixion of Christ while being judged for their sins. They had to maintain this sacred position while experiencing excruciating pain, creating a twisted parallel between their suffering and divine sacrifice. The ordeal was particularly cruel because it favored certain body types and fitness levels over others. Young, strong men had significant advantages over women, children, or the elderly. The tradition essentially institutionalized discrimination based on physical capabilities, disguising it as divine judgment. Communities would gather to watch these ordeals like sporting events, cheering for their preferred outcome and placing bets on who would collapse first. The sacred nature of the crucifixion position was completely perverted, turning Christ's sacrifice into a spectacle of community entertainment. Medieval justice wasn't content with simple execution. It developed elaborate traditions of judicial maiming that turned punishment into a twisted art form. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully choreographed rituals designed to match the punishment to the crime in increasingly creative and horrific ways. Thieves had their hands cut off, but the process was ceremonial. The convicted person was brought to a public square where a specially designed block was set up. The hand was placed on the block, and the executioner would use a specially blessed axe to remove it while the crowd watched. The severed hand was then displayed on a pole as a warning to others. But the tradition evolved into increasingly elaborate forms of symbolic justice. Counterfeiters had their hands removed with the same tools they used to create fake coins. Perjurers had their tongues cut out with ceremonial knives. Adulterers were subjected to genital mutilation using implements specifically designed for the purpose. The most twisted aspect was how these punishments were designed to be both functional and symbolic. A thief without hands couldn't steal again, but the missing limb also marked them permanently as a criminal. They would never be able to hide their past, ensuring lifelong social exclusion and economic hardship. The church sanctified these mutilations, arguing that physical suffering in this life would reduce punishment in the next. Priests would bless the instruments of torture, pray over the condemned, and interpret the victim's screams as evidence of spiritual purification. Communities developed specialized craftsmen who created increasingly sophisticated torture devices. These weren't crude instruments, but carefully designed tools that could inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim alive. The craftsmanship that went into creating these devices reveals how deeply embedded torture was in medieval culture. Medieval Europe developed one of history's most macabre traditions: the worship of human remains. This wasn't simple reverence for the dead. It was a complex economy built around the buying, selling, and stealing of body parts, creating a culture where human remains became more valuable than gold. The tradition began innocently enough, with communities preserving the bodies of local saints and martyrs. But it quickly evolved into a twisted marketplace where human body parts were traded like commodities. Churches competed to acquire the most impressive collections of bones, teeth, hair, and even bodily fluids from dead holy people. The demand for relics was so intense that it created an entire industry of forgery and grave robbing. Professional relic hunters would break into tombs, steal bodies, and sell the remains to the highest bidder. A single saint's skeleton could be sold to dozens of different churches, each believing they owned the authentic remains. But the tradition became even more disturbing when living people began volunteering to become relics. Some religious fanatics would deliberately mutilate themselves, cutting off fingers, toes, or other body parts to distribute to churches while they were still alive. They believed that spreading their living flesh would increase their chances of sainthood. The church not only tolerated but actively encouraged this trade in human remains. Bishops would authenticate relics, often knowing they were forgeries, because possessing impressive relics brought prestige and pilgrimage income. The Vatican itself maintained vast collections of human body parts, treating them as institutional assets. Communities would go to war over relics, launching military campaigns to steal particularly valuable body parts from neighboring regions. The theft of a saint's finger could spark armed conflict between entire kingdoms, with thousands dying to possess decomposing human remains. Medieval churches offered sanctuary to anyone who claimed it, providing protection from secular justice. This tradition, originally designed as an act of mercy, evolved into one of the most twisted forms of imprisonment in history. When someone committed a crime and fled to a church, they were supposedly safe from arrest. But the reality was far more sinister. The person claiming sanctuary became a prisoner of the church, trapped inside the building indefinitely, neither free nor formally incarcerated. The church would provide minimal food and water, just enough to keep the sanctuary seeker alive. But they were forbidden from leaving, prohibited from working, and cut off from all contact with the outside world. Many people who claimed sanctuary died of starvation, disease, or despair while still inside the church. The most twisted aspect was how churches used sanctuary seekers as forced labor. Since the people couldn't leave, they were essentially slaves who had to work for their meager sustenance. They cleaned the church, maintained the grounds, and performed other tasks under the constant threat of being turned over to secular authorities. Some churches developed elaborate systems for exploiting sanctuary seekers. They would charge rent for the space, demand payment for food, and require sanctuary seekers to sign over their property as payment for protection. People who had fled to churches for safety found themselves systematically robbed by the very institution that claimed to protect them. The tradition created a perverse incentive for churches to encourage crime, since sanctuary seekers provided free labor and potential wealth. Some churches would actively harbor criminals, knowing they could extract years of unpaid work from people who had no choice but to remain. Medieval Europe developed an obsession with death that manifested in one of its most twisted traditions, the Dance of Death. This wasn't simply artwork or literature. It was a cultural phenomenon that turned mortality into public performance and community entertainment. The Dance of Death began as artistic representations showing death as a dancing skeleton, leading people from all walks of life to their graves. But it evolved into actual performances where communities would stage elaborate productions featuring death as the central character. These performances were incredibly disturbing. Actors dressed as corpses would dance with members of the audience, symbolically claiming them for death. The audience was encouraged to participate, dancing with the representation of their own mortality while contemplating their inevitable fate. But the tradition became even more twisted when communities began incorporating real death into the performances. Recently deceased community members would be exhumed and their bodies used as props in the dance. Skeletons were manipulated like puppets, dancing with living performers in grotesque displays of necrophilia. The church endorsed these performances, seeing them as spiritual instruction about the temporary nature of life. Priests would deliver sermons during the performances, using the dancing corpses as visual aids to discuss sin, judgment, and eternal damnation. Communities competed to create the most elaborate death dances, incorporating increasingly realistic corpses, more sophisticated choreography, and more terrifying imagery. Children were required to attend these performances, ensuring that the obsession with death was passed to the next generation. Medieval communities developed the ordeal of water as a method of determining guilt, but this tradition was particularly twisted in how it guaranteed the death of innocent people while potentially saving the guilty. The process involved binding the accused person and throwing them into a body of water, usually a river or pond. The community believed that water, as a pure element blessed by God, would reject sinful people and accept the innocent. If the person sank, they were declared innocent, but they would also drown. If they floated, they were guilty and would be executed. This created an impossible situation where innocence was determined by death. The only way to be declared innocent was to die during the ordeal. People who survived the drowning were automatically guilty and faced execution anyway. The tradition reveals the complete breakdown of logical thinking in medieval justice. Communities would gather to watch these drownings, celebrating when someone sank as proof of their innocence, while simultaneously watching an innocent person die. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that they saw no contradiction in this system. But the ordeal was also manipulated by those who administered it. The binding could be done loosely or tightly, affecting whether someone would sink or float. The choice of water location could influence the outcome. The tradition gave enormous power to local officials who could essentially determine guilt or innocence through their preparation methods. Women were particularly vulnerable to this ordeal, as they were more likely to float due to body composition and clothing. The tradition was often used to eliminate women who were considered troublesome, with the community using the ordeal as a socially acceptable form of murder. These twisted traditions reveal the true nature of medieval Europe. Not the romanticized world of chivalrous knights and noble quests, but a society where cruelty was systematized, suffering was entertainment, and the most horrific practices were justified by religion and law. What makes these traditions particularly disturbing is not just their brutality, but their universality. These weren't the practices of isolated madmen or fringe groups. They were the cherished customs of entire civilizations, passed down through generations, blessed by religious authorities, and celebrated by communities. The medieval period shows us how easily human societies can normalize the most extreme forms of cruelty when they're wrapped in the language of justice, religion, and tradition. Every one of these practices was defended by intelligent, educated people who genuinely believed they were serving God, upholding law, and protecting their communities. Perhaps most chilling of all is the recognition that these traditions didn't disappear because people suddenly became more moral or enlightened. They disappeared because they became inconvenient, inefficient, or politically problematic. The capacity for such systematic cruelty remains within human nature, waiting for the right conditions to resurface. The medieval period stands as a permanent reminder that civilization is far more fragile than we imagine, and that the difference between justice and torture, between tradition and cruelty, between faith and fanaticism, is often nothing more than the perspective of those in power.